Welcome. My name is Jeff Colgan. I'm the director of the Climate Solutions Lab, and it is my very great pleasure to introduce today and have in conversation Todd Stern, who is a senior fellow here at the Watson Institute. And he's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institute and a non-resident distinguished fellow at the Asia Society. I assume that's non-resident. And Asia Society seems awfully hard. In all of those appointments, he is concentrating on climate change, and not surprisingly because Todd Stern served from January 2009 to April 2016 as the Special Envoy for Climate Change at the Department of State. That is the same position that Secretary Kerry is stepping down from now. And so he was President Obama's chief climate negotiator, leading the U.S. effort in negotiating the landmark Paris Agreement in 2015. And was also the negotiator in all bilateral and multilateral climate negotiations in the 7 years leading up to Paris. Stern is currently focused on writing about the climate negotiations. We were just talking about it, so he is almost done that voyage, and he has a new book that will be coming out in September entitled Landing the Paris Climate Agreement, How It Happened, Why It Matters, and What Comes Next with MIT Press. And so we will talk a little bit about that book in a moment, but just to lay the sort of the groundwork for today, we have until 1 o'clock. I want to make the best use of our time here, and so what we'll do is I'm going to do sort of Q&A for 20 or 30 minutes, and then I'm going to turn it over to all of you, and we'll have the rest of that time, so almost half an hour, to hear from your questions. And so start thinking of what I don't ask right now, so that you'll be ready to ask Todd Stern the questions that are on your mind. Without further ado...
I should say first that I have some pretty good brown cred. My wife went here, and our second son graduated, I guess 2.5 years ago, 3 years ago, and I have a freshman here also, so...
Fantastic.
Good,
that
good,
is not in my bio
good,
for you,
good,
and I'm delighted.
Good brown cred. So happy to be here.
And we can only assume that, your sterling career in government would have been even better if only we had managed to get you as well along. But I'm glad so much of your family has some Brown connections. So, let's start with sort of the headline of your career, which is the Paris Agreement. Tell us about your role in that negotiation and why it still matters today, that the landmark agreement that you came to.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. My role was basically I was the leader for the United States in all of our negotiations. Different countries, most countries have the minister of something or other in this position. The U.S. doesn't do it that way. So I was at state, but I was President Obama's special envoy. So I had a team of probably, add all the different pieces up, probably 25, 30 people. And figuring out what we were going to do strategically and going to every kind of meeting from one other person to a room with 195 countries was all the stuff that I was doing. So happy to answer any more questions about that, but why don't I get right to the Paris Agreement itself? And the Paris Agreement was like a huge, big deal. When I was actually talking to different publishers about the book, I remember talking to somebody at Yale and one of the people in their publishing. In the Yale Press, and he said, well, the way you should think about Paris is that it's the biggest international agreement for the last 100 years. I was like, whoa, wait a minute. But it is, whether that's exactly true or not, it was a really, really big deal, because climate change is such a big deal. And it was, basically the countries of the world, there was an original climate treaty that was done, called the Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992. It set up a framework, sort of set up a broad structure, but didn't really push people to do things. And so there was clearly a need for an actual operational agreement. And essentially, it took 25 years to get there. What the Paris Agreement does is, first of all, dealing with climate change. Climate change is a sort of inherently international problem that cannot be done without an international aspect to it, because the greenhouse gases that cause climate change affect the United States, whether the emissions come from Detroit or the emissions come from India. So everything that goes up into the atmosphere spreads across the whole world, and it's very unlike most environmental problems, whether it's clean air, clean water, toxic waste, whatever, which are quite local. Climate change is the opposite of that. So all countries are affected, and there's no way really to deal with it without getting all countries engaged. The process of getting an international climate agreement of any kind done is extraordinarily difficult. Climate change, greenhouse gases come from basically running our economies in all the ways that they have traditionally run. So you have lots of countries, particularly countries, developing countries, who are very skittish. They were much more worried early on about what they were supposed to do to deal with climate change than with climate change itself, because they were afraid that it would affect, still are concerned that it'll affect their capacity to grow. So you had that a fundamental problem, and you had somewhere in the 195 to 200 country range, and you had a practice of decision making within the climate body known as the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is also the body itself, a decision-making practice which was essentially required consensus, which means hardly anybody can dissent, or else you don't have an agreement. So all of this is really, really difficult. Paris ended up being tremendously, I think, successful as an agreement. It went, I think, beyond most any country's kind of highest expectation of what might get done at the actual Paris conference. It sets forth strong goals with respect to holding temperature down and holding emissions down. It is built into it is a system of continually ratcheting up what countries say that they're going to do, what countries agree to do. So every 5 years, countries are supposed to re-up what they've done and to a higher level. And on a staggered basis, every 5 years, there's what's called a global stocktake, which takes a look at how all the countries of the world are doing in the aggregate against what the science is telling us.
Todd, can I jump in on that?
Sure, jump in on,
so
I can go on too long.
No. On these commitments that you're talking about, the nationally determined commitments, right? The NDCs that are part of the Paris Agreement.
Right.
As you say, that countries are supposed to update them every 5 years.
Right.
But it's now been more than 5 years since Paris, and not every country has updated it. So what's your reflection on sort of the degree to which countries are doing that?
Yeah, the countries, with respect to the updating, countries have not, there's not an entirely positive answer to your question, but just in terms of the updating itself, the Paris was done in 2015. The first period that ought to have where that ought to have come into play was in 2020. The COVID was going on then, so that COP was postponed. It was held the next year in 2021, And most countries did do that. Most countries, and not all did. The most important one that really didn't do anything of significance then was China. China at this point is a little less than 1/3 of global emissions. It's really huge. But many countries did, and then the 2025 time for doing that will be next year, and I think there's a general expectation that all countries are going to do something. The U.S. actually put in a very strong. So the U.S. was completely AWOL after. So we literally got the agreement done in 2015. It entered into force. There's all sorts of stuff that has to happen to get an agreement into force. It entered into force 4 days before Trump was elected. So that was a bit of a downer, to put it mildly. And the U.S. was basically AWOL during the Trump years, but then came back very strong under Biden, and the U.S. put up a very strong target, which will be hard to meet, but if we survive the election this year, I think we will meet it. But more broadly to your question, the thing you've got to understand about Paris is Paris cannot, and I don't think any agreement, no agreement that was feasible to get done could have actually forced countries to do things. It can lay out what should be done, but it can't force. You don't have the capacity to do an agreement for a bunch of reasons I won't get into right now. But you can't do an agreement that had legally binding targets, and honestly, even if you did, there's really no way you would have had a legally binding agreement with punishment if you didn't. So I mean, when you're working in the international sphere, there's so much you can do and so much you can't, and so what's going to be critical for this whole thing to work is that Paris sets out this structure, and countries need to have basically the political will and desire to do what's necessary.
So Paris has a lot of moving parts, as you
Yes.
certainly know, right?
Yeah.
And you've mentioned, the targets, right? So like 2 degrees Celsius or well under 2 degrees Celsius targets. And then we've talked about the national determined contributions. Can you just say a word about, maybe 1 or 2 other components that you think are kind of the most important? I mean, there was like land use stuff, there was red stuff. I mean, so can you just tell us a little bit about those?
Yeah, well, there's a system of what's called transparency, which is very important. It's the thing that allows countries all to see what other countries are doing and whether they're following through with what they're doing. The basic, what transparency involves is a system of countries reporting I think it's about every 2 years, on how they're doing with respect to the pledges that they made and what their inventories are. So, like, how did you do on your pledge? But also, like, add it all up. What are your emissions?
And just a method for doing that,
Yeah.
right? For counting,
Right,
The actual
right.
emissions. Right.
So that was really important. That was one of the first things that we came into 2009. 2009 was the first COP for us in the Obama administration, and there was really broad resistance to that kind of system, particularly among developing countries. And it took, we took a big step there, but there was a lot more to do, and in Paris, that ended up being done quite well. There's a really important element of Paris, which has not been done well yet, and that's the promise of developed countries to provide enough funding to developing countries. The original, there was a pledge that was made by developing countries all the way back to the Copenhagen. These are all called COPs. It's Conference of the Parties. So if you see, the COP is happening this December or this November, that's what that's talking about. So the first COP that the Obama team went to was in 2009, and a key part of getting that that conference was kind of a mess, very chaotic, almost a train wreck. In the view of most countries around the world, a disaster, even now, a big failure. Actually really important COP. And one of the things that it included was a pledge to provide $100 billion a year to developing countries to mobilize it. So this could be actual government money or government policy that helps stimulate private investment, $100 billion a year to developing countries by 2020. That was realized, I think, this year, so it's just like 3 years late. And it's not actually nearly enough. And there's all sorts of work being done around the world. In the G20, it's a group of 20 countries developed and developing that meet once a year. Both in the last 2 or 3 have focused a lot on how to make much better use of what are called the multilateral development banks, the World Bank and then several others, to use their resources much more effectively, and this is an area that I'm quite interested in. Because unless we get this part right, unless we get funding flowing to developing countries the right way, they're not going to develop the right way, for starters. And you also will have this animosity which has pervaded the climate negotiations between developed and developing countries ever since I had anything to do with it. And I happen to think it's quite important to get past that into a much more kind of constructive relationship.
Great. Okay, so I want to take us a little bit farther forward in time, right, to our most recent COP meeting, which was in Abu Dhabi. And it was a bit of a controversial location, let alone outcome for COP. So tell us a little bit about, we give it a grade maybe on effectiveness, and maybe talk to us a little bit about particularly the fossil fuel industry. To what extent is COP meaningfully affecting the fossil fuel industry?
So what's going on in the world is affecting the fossil fuel industry, although not enough yet. And what's going on in the world is, of course, in part responsive to the COP. So the location was, as you said, something that stimulated a lot of concern in the kind of climate community, because the UAE is one of the biggest oil and gas producers in the world. The guy who, his name is Sultan Al Jaber, who used to be their lead climate guy, so I got to know him pretty well back some years ago. But he has ended up also being the person who runs the state oil and gas company. So you would think, gee, there's isn't that a conflict of interest, right? When we're trying to get rid of fossil fuels, and there we are going to Dubai. All of that is true. It's also true that he is a quite smart and capable guy, and more good stuff happened coming out of Dubai than you might have thought. So there's good language. I don't have it with me right now, and I don't remember off the top of my head, but there's quite good language in the agreement about the need to, I think the words they used were transition away from fossil fuels, and to in a way that will be consistent with getting to net zero emissions by 2050, which is a term that has come into widespread use, starting with a very important scientific report by the UN's climate body. It's known as the IPCC, which was called for actually by a little paid attention to provision in the Paris Agreement itself, saying that the IPCC should take a look at the notion of holding temperature down to 1.5 degrees increase compared to pre-industrial. That's 1.5 Celsius. And that report basically said the standard and the main goal that was in Paris, which is under 2 degrees, is not good enough. And it really started to change the mentality of the climate community. And if you were trying to get to hold to 1.5 rather than 2, that would mean you'd have to get to essentially zero emissions by 2050 rather than 2070. So a big damn deal, because it's really hard to get to net zero emissions. The net means that if you have offsetting, if there's offsetting stuff that sort of sucks carbon, there's naturally offsetting, trees and nature will offset some. But in any event, you've got to get to, on a net basis, zero. So, yeah.
That shift between, 27 to 2050, right, the sort of 2-degree target to 1.5 degree target, would you say that politically had the effect of making climate change less of a future problem and more of a right damn now problem?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think two things have made it that. One being what you just said, but also what we see in the world around us, what's happening to countries all over the world, is just kind of off the charts, and has been getting worse and worse, and unfortunately it's continuing to, and it's going to continue to, and so I think that seeing the havoc that is wreaked in China, in India, in the United States, and everywhere, Africa, Latin America, I think is focusing minds more. And yet there is still, and I should say that it's focusing minds more. There's also, if you ask me sort of in a nutshell, sort of how do things look right now overall? And I would say so the science and the impacts that we see are worse and faster than anybody had predicted. So the notion that, people used to say, and people who didn't want to talk about climate change, or were in businesses that didn't want climate change to exist as an issue, might have tried to say this is all being exaggerated, whatever. That's the sciences, and the scientists are exaggerating. They're not exaggerating. They've always, I think, responsibly said what they thought, and mostly they've been behind the curve, not ahead of the curve. So that's bad. What we see in terms of technological transformation, the sort of the clean tech revolution, is faster, better, and more impressive than anybody assumed or figured out. And the main kind of the sort of traditional respected modelers, the International Energy Agency and many others, completely missed what was happening, and it's all happening much better and much faster. So that's really good. And then the other thing is that in terms of how much we need, it's really good, but still not nearly fast enough to do what we need. And there's lots of obstacles to that, and most of those obstacles have something to do with the fossil fuel industry.
Okay, so good. So I want to just do 3 more questions, and then I'm going to open it up. And so I wonder if we could shift away from COP and think more broadly about other diplomatic initiatives, like the various U.S.-China meetings or the Global Methane Pledge. And if you could just give us a sense of kind of how they rate in terms of significance, which ones you think are most important, and what's your take on them? Yeah,
well, all of those things are very important, and one of the things that is that's important about the COP is that it brings everybody together once a year. It now brings everybody together, countries together, but not only countries, but at the highest level. I mean, leaders generally come now, didn't used to. It also brings, so in Paris, most important COP meeting ever, there were 40,000 people, which included all of the various negotiators. There's a few thousand of them, and a bunch of press and people from business and international organizations and all of that, and all added up to 40,000. There were 100,000 people in Dubai. Much less important compared to Paris, 100,000 people, because it has been and probably the biggest number of those from business, and most of them not trying to do bad things, most of them trying to figure out how to do useful things. So all of that is good. Now to get back to your specific question, I think first of all, do the more concrete one, which is methane. So there's a bunch of different greenhouse gases. CO2 is by far the biggest and by far the most important, because once it goes up, it lasts there a long time, like hundreds of years, if not more. Methane, a lot more more potent year by year, like for 20 years or so. But you say for 20 years or so because then it's out of the atmosphere, so that's good. Methane accounts now, even though there's a lot more CO2. Methane accounts for about a third of the warming that we experience right now in the atmosphere and on Earth, and so it's a big opportunity. It can be cut a lot easier than CO2 in many ways, and it can have an immediate impact, almost immediate impact, on how warm it is up there in the atmosphere. So that has become a really obsessive, almost, focus for the United States. Started, I think, with Europe, the methane pledge. There's now 140 or something countries who are part of it. China has always held back, again, big problem, but there is agreement between the U.S. and China to start working on methane now. So that's an example of something that's really important. So the diplomacy between the U.S. and China was certainly, while I was there, I think it's probably still true, but it was more productive, not because Kerry did a bad job. Kerry did a very good job, but the overall relationship between the two countries is very different now. But the relationship with China and the agreements that we reached with China were tremendously important. It made Paris possible. And there were, I can think of certainly two of them that were really important, three even. But the most important was a secret negotiation that we started with the Chinese. We had the idea to do this, and this was in 2014. We had a pretty good year in 2013 with China. So first of the Obama terms was Hillary Clinton was the Secretary of State, and then the second Kerry was. And Kerry has been, like, when Kerry was in the Senate, he was sort of the conscience of the Senate on climate change. This has been something that he's been quite, in a good way, obsessed about for a long time. And he came in wanting to get going on China right away. And so he established a joint working group between the U.S. and China, which was good. There was a separate effort that was started on a still different kind of greenhouse gas, which are called HFCs, and they're industrial gas. They're not a big percentage yet, but they are very, very potent. And so there was a desire that had started an effort that started at state to try to phase them down or even out, even before the Obama administration. But then we picked it up when we got there, and there were about 100 countries that had signed on to a statement pushing in this direction. China, a number of others were not for it. One of the people on our team got the good idea to try to use a different body, not the climate body, but a body that worries about the ozone hole, because HFCs were invented in the first place because they didn't affect the ozone layer. People didn't figure out that they were really bad for climate change until later. But we worked out a deal with the Chinese, which turned into something important. But the 2014 exercise was meant to work with the Chinese so that both presidents would jointly announce their expected targets for Paris. So remember, Paris would be coming up in 2015. So to announce in 2014, November, what their targets would be, to work together during the year on those targets, and for the two presidents to kind of join hands and pledge that, insofar as there weren't going to be any problems around the world on various elements of Paris, that the two presidents will work together to try to get them solved so that the agreement could be done. This was an absolutely electrifying announcement when it happened. We had always expected, we tried really hard to keep it secret. When you're in this kind of a business, you always have to have the standby press statement in case it leaks. And we sort of thought it would leak, but it never leaked. So there in Beijing, in the Great Hall of the People, Barack Obama and Xi Jinping walking kind of figuratively arm in arm down the aisle, essentially big red carpet, and then announced this, and it's just huge, and it's the thing that made countries all over the world believe that for the first time in 25 years of trying, this thing was actually going to happen. So I'll stop there. So you can.
That's great. So we've used our 30 minutes, but I'm going to infringe upon it just a little bit more. I'm going to ask you two questions at once, and so you can talk a little bit about both of them. One is on the domestic side, right? So we've talked all about international side. There's probably lots more that I could ask you about. But given the moment that we're in an election year, we know that this is fraught. What are the prospects for further domestic political progress on climate change? And second, and this is important.
That one's going to be a really short answer.
Yeah,
so
right.
Go to the second one.
Second is what advice you might have for the Brown students in the audience about a career that does good on climate change, whether that's inside or outside of government.
So on your first question, talk to me after November 5th. I mean, we are either going into a dark age, which we all hope that does not happen, on climate change and on many things, or we're cranking away on presumably a second Biden administration, unless he decides not to run, but I don't think that's going to happen. If Trump wins, I mean, we know where Trump's at. I mean, he'll ridicule it. He'll do everything he can to crank up fossil fuels, and he'll do everything. He'll pull out of Paris, and it'll be bad. And it's super important for many reasons, not only climate change, also for things like abortion and many other issues. My wife is the head of the Gender Policy Council at the White House, so I'm very up to date on all that stuff. But everybody who looks at Biden and feels like, I mean, assuming you're not a Trump Republican, but everybody looks at Biden and thinks like, God, I don't know why he's running, and like I'm sick of this guy, and he's too old, and this, that, and the other thing, and I don't want to vote, and I don't want to vote. It could not be more important. And get energized and get your friends to do the same. You can have all the reservations that you want about Biden, and a lot of Democrats do. I think not because I like Biden. He's a good guy. Running again, a little bit another question, but that's what's happening. And whether we're talking about climate change or democracy or peace in the world, NATO, you name it. It's all on the line. So yes, I gave a longer answer than I was supposed to.
Yeah, that was the short answer.
Yeah, that was the short answer. No, advice. Look, there's a tremendous. This is a burgeoning world in terms of creating. Not just obviously you can work in government on climate change. You can work in the State Department. You can work in other places. But there's but the need to, and not just the need to, but the fact of this enormous transformation. This is going on like heavy, and it's going to get heavier, and you can find places to work in in the national government, in state governments, if they're, significant states, in cities, for companies that are trying to do the right thing, sometimes trying to do the very right thing, sometimes trying to do at least better than they're doing. All of those opportunities, NGOs, right, and the world of civil society. In some respects, the world of civil society, to me, is the biggest game in town. I'm not telling you that that's where you should work, but the only way we really get to where we need to go is for there to be a sort of collective will at a much stronger level than we've seen. And if you do polling and stuff, young people are much more tuned into this than others. But if I go back to 1970, 1970 was the first Earth Day. 1970, the Earth Day came about because there was a growing environmental consciousness that sort of started with a famous book called, by Rachel Carson, called
Silent Spring.
Silent Spring, right? And there was just all this pollution happening. The Cuyahoga River in Ohio literally caught on fire. So you had this, and you had a senator from Wisconsin who thought that he could tap into the activism of young people that had been going like full tilt for almost a decade over the Vietnam War, over civil rights, over women's rights, et cetera, and tap into that for the environment. So what happened is 20 million people hit the streets on Earth Day, and there were teach-ins all over, and what happened as a result of that was that the EPA got started, and the Clean Air Act got promulgated, and the Clean Water Act, and on and on and on, during the administration of Richard Nixon. So activism matters, and we don't have enough of it yet. Okay.
It's good. Thank you so much, Todd. So the floor is open to anyone who might have a question, and I'm going to call on Matthias first.
So on the China issue, so IPCC says we need to reduce emissions 45% by 2030, and from 2020 to 2030, China has increased emissions 13% already by now. Do you think China is pulling its weight in the global fight against climate change? And what kind of international pressure, or can China be influenced by international pressure, and if so, how should that be done?
Yeah, great questions. So China's definitely not pulling its weight. China's a little bit of a mixed bag. I mean, I think you could argue, well, it's a mixed bag. I mean, they're absolutely not pulling their weight. They are not, they're not moving nearly rapidly enough away from coal. They're still building coal plants. They've also done more to advance clean energy, renewable energy, solar, wind, and other things than anybody else in the world by a fair amount. And I notice and take some comfort in the fact that Xi Jinping announced at this point 2 or 3 years ago that China would basically reach net zero. They called it something else, but it's basically net zero before 2060. So it's a little later than we would like, but the one thing that China has so far demonstrated is usually China under-promises to make sure that they always meet their targets. So they don't, like, we try to sort of, at least when I was there, and I think the same is true in the Biden administration now, sort of go for stretch targets to try to, if you think you can do 15, say 16, and then like if you come up a little short, then but you've still pushed the envelope. Chinese, if they think they can do 15, promise 12, and that's traditionally been the way that they've acted. But net zero for China by, let's say, 2059, be a huge big deal, and they are super sensitive about doing what they say they're going to do. So I think that now in terms of pressure, so they're not pulling their weight, but I would not be surprised to see a lot of movement start there. Not quite yet. I mean, in terms of coal and stuff, not enough yet, but to have that happen the way it needs to. In terms of pressure, I think that, one thing I think is something you need to do, but is not enough, is just for the U.S. to like go banging on the door. That is part of it. But one of the things that was really an important development in terms of it at Paris, and it had been built up to before Paris, but was the creation of something that ended up being called the High Ambition Coalition. And it was a group of countries that was mostly the vulnerable and poor countries in the world, but also the Europeans, also the U.S. and sort of the non-European developed countries, U.S., China, Japan, Australia, et cetera. And that group calling for higher ambition, definitely higher ambition than the Chinese wanted, it put pressure on China in the sense that they pushed for stronger measures, which gave France as the host and as the one controlling the pen, the backing to push stronger stuff in Paris than it would have otherwise, and for China not to complain about it. So I think that and China very much is very unhappy about being put in a bad light in the eyes of poor countries. I mean, they still are insistent to the death in being a developing country, and they don't want to be out of sync with developing countries. So I think having that kind of an alliance is important. And I'm going to stop the answer now, except to say that it comes back around to another reason why finance is so important. It's important for the thing itself. Countries need it. Poor countries need it. But it's also important to be able to get an alliance where they're not paying more attention to China and China's financial assistance and so forth than they could be by countries who want to push China.
Eva.
Hi, thank you so much for coming in.
Sure.
It's been super interesting. So I'm wondering, like you were talking about the world of like civil society as like people, like what we're paying attention to, but then also on like a global scale, how do you think the war in Gaza is going to impact or is impacting interest in climate action right now and like in the future? Like, will it shift? Because obviously there's a lot of attention on that area.
Yeah. Well, I think the war in Gaza is horrible. So I definitely think that. I don't know how much it's going to actually end up affecting climate. You haven't seen, I mean, the countries in the kind of oil world in the Middle East are generally countries that have not been on any front line trying to take action on climate change. I think that, and I also don't think that that we're going to get to where we need to get to in terms of fossil fuels by persuading Saudi Arabia or the UAE or any of these countries to not do the thing that makes them a huge amount of money, or Exxon or the others. The thing that I think has to happen more than anything else is to take the demand down, right? So that if people can buy and like electric vehicles cheaper than they can get regular vehicles and fill the tank up with gas. We're not there yet, but we're getting really close. In the next 3 or 4 years, electric cars will be, probably across the board, depending on the kind of car, as cheap as others. So if you reduce the demand for oil, cars, trucks, aviation, all sorts of things, And different kinds of technology to be able to produce steel and cement and other things that are polluting and need fossil fuels. That's the way you're going to get rid of fossil fuels, I think. At least mostly that's the way. I mean, I don't think, I mean, Gaza is upsetting and stressing countries all over the world for completely understandable reasons. By the way, the thing that provoked Gaza was pretty terrible also, but I don't think that's a climate issue, at least not that I'm seeing. I might be wrong.
Yeah, please. Sorry, did you have a question? Yeah.
Yes. How do you feel about nuclear energy?
I think nuclear energy is appropriately part of the mix. I mean, I think that you obviously want nuclear energy that is as safe and accident-free as possible. There's various different kinds. People have been talking. I don't know the technology of this at all, but people have been using the word small modular reactors for like 20 years, I think. I think Bill Gates has been very bullish on this, and maybe there's something to it, and it can work pretty safely. Any way we can get our energy that's not sending fossil fuels up into the sending carbon up into the air, it has to be taken pretty seriously. But obviously, you can have problems. I think I wouldn't rule it out.
I think we'll just take one more question before we end, and I think I saw your hand first, so please.
Kind of a follow-up to the last question. How do you see nuclear energy being appropriately in the mix? I think looking more at the domestic side, when you look at the 2035 and 2030 climate goals set out by the Department of Energy, a lot of that is getting rid of our dispatchable power, right? Coal and natural gas plants.
Yeah.
But are we really appropriately compensating for that with solar? I know a lot of states are using battery power, but nuclear seems to be the only relatively clean dispatchable power option, and we're developing very little of it domestically.
Yeah, so I think, one of the problems with nuclear at the moment is it's just a lot more expensive than the renewable alternatives. And I think, and again, I'm not the tech guy, but I think that that the promise of batteries, and that's not the only option. I think that's the option people are talking about the most right now, is a pretty viable option. I mean, because you have like there's tremendous amount of innovative work being done in all of these areas. So there's batteries all over the place, and there's like tons more research on battery alternatives. Other kinds of batteries, in other words. And so you're completely right about the dispatchable issue. I mean, solar and wind don't have that. But I think, again, I think that if there's nuclear technology that can compete just on a financial basis, I think it'll potentially happen, but I think there's other ways to get past the dispatchable issue.
Well, great. Maybe we have time for just one more. I saw a hand over there, so please, go ahead.
Oh, thank you so much. I have a question about climate tech. So since there's a lot of friction, you mentioned the deployment has been really surprising, really good, but also there's like protectionism, for example, access of EV to various kinds of markets, and it seems like that is inhibiting the deployment of clean tech. So I guess I have two questions. One, is this issue being addressed in any of the international negotiations, or is it considered a separate like trade or economic energy security issue? Second of all, what do you think would be the most effective arrangement looking at supply chains or how these industries are organized that's going to get us to the climate goal?
Yeah. So, I think that the supply chain issue is super complicated. I think it is right for the U.S. and Europeans and others to want to diversify the supply chain, which right now, with respect to renewable energy, the so-called critical minerals and materials that are required for renewable energy, it's hugely dominated right now by China. And to some extent, just having the mines and stuff, or having deals with mines that are in Africa or Latin America, but even much more so the processing ability. I mean, Chinese are really, really good at that, and they've gotten it down to a really, really low price. And competitors, U.S., Europeans, and so forth, Australians, want to be able to create alternatives, but I think it's going to take time before you get alternatives that can begin to compete on price. In terms of the first part of your question, that was sort of more trade related, right?
So is it, this issue, is it being addressed by international negotiations?
But are you talking about raising barriers to imports and stuff? That
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like the deployment of clean tech.
Yeah. I think that it's not simply going to be done through trade. I mean, the EU. I mean, the actual policy measure that is the most on people's minds is the EU. And I'm forgetting what the name of the policy is, but they're basically for if you're importing products that have carbon content, then and those kinds of products pay a fee in Europe, right? There's their
The CBAM.
yeah, the CBAM. There's sort of their form of the cap and trade program. Then, in order to not have European steel or other kinds of manufacturers treated unfairly compared to the products coming in, then if there aren't similar efforts made in those products to reduce their carbon, then it's a pretty good idea in principle to try to balance out, even out those prices, but it's very controversial. So I don't know where that's going to end up, how that's going to end up working, and I think I don't, the WTO, maybe I don't know. I mean, I'm not on top of that, other than to know that it's a source of great aggravation for China, maybe India, others who want to sell their products and now have an extra fee that could get charged. And again, the Europeans' view is that's the only way to level it out. So I think we're going to just have to see where that goes.
Well, unfortunately, we are running up against 1 o'clock when a lot of classes start, and so I wonder if you can join me in thanking Todd Stern for sharing some of his experience on climate negotiations today.